Okay, so now that we've talked about IELTS Part 1 and Part 2 strategies, we're on to the last part of the speaking section, which is the IELTS Part 3 speaking skills. And again, just a quick review. Remember that IELTS Part 3 for the speaking, these are questions which will be connected with the topic of Part 2. So in our example, which is taken from www.aehelp.com, Part 2 is talking about role models. So the Part 3 questions are continuing with the idea of role models and people who we look up to or who we respect. So this is a really important reason why you have to do very well on Part 2, because that will help you to get a much better score for Part 3. So Part 3, the examiner will ask you some detailed questions. It's really important to remember that these questions are not everyday questions. So nobody asks these kinds of questions from anyone on the street. The reason why that's important is because these questions, you need time to think about the answer, and that's okay. So before you're answering the examiner, try to take a couple of seconds to think about the clear response. So for Part 3, buy time to give good answers. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can get some time to help you with the answers. So if we look at the questions for Part 3 now, we can see that the first question is asking about what kind of attributes a good role model should have. So if you understand this question but need time to think, one skill that you can do is paraphrase the question. For example, you can say something like, so, just to be clear, you are asking me about the important characteristics of a role model. So when you paraphrase the question like this, then it's actually giving you time to think about the answer in your head. For example, the examiner asks me, what are some attributes that a good role model should have? My response, just to be clear, you're asking me about the characteristics that are important for a good role model. Well, I suppose that good role models should be trustworthy, they should be honest, and they should be fair. Alright, so when you paraphrase like this, you're actually buying yourself about 10 or 15 seconds to think about a good answer, and it helps your brain to think. This is what politicians do, this is what lawyers do when somebody asks them a question. Another way that you can buy time is simply just ask for it. And this is natural, so it's okay to do this. For example, that's an interesting question. Can I think about it for a second? And it's absolutely okay to do that. So it's absolutely okay that when you have a question which needs some thinking, that you ask for some time. This is what we would do with our friends or our family or anyone, our teacher, our classmate, if we were asked a difficult question. So you can say, that's an interesting question. Can I think about it for a minute? Well, I suppose that role models should be hardworking. For example, sports stars who are role models for many children practice and exercise 8 to 10 hours every day. So it's okay to use this to help you think about the answer. Now, if you need even more time, then you can combine these two techniques. So you can say, so just to be clear, you're asking me about the important characteristics of a role model. Well, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that for a second. I guess that good role models should be honest. They should always tell the truth. For example, when a sports star makes a mistake, if they get into a fight during a pub, then they should tell the media what happened and be honest about the situation. So again, when you combine these two, that gives you lots of time to think about the answer, and it's natural, it's good English. So I strongly suggest using these skills in part 3 to help with your score. All right, let's listen to part 3 and see how this student uses these skills to help answer some of the questions. Okay, stop. That is the end of part 2. I will now ask you some specific questions related to the topic of part 2. We will now begin part 3. What attributes should a role model have?
That is an interesting question. Can you give me a moment?
Certainly.
I believe the qualities a role model should possess are honesty, integrity, and kindness. Young people learn from role models, and these are the most important attributes a role model should be teaching children, because these traits help children become good people.
Why are role models important in a person's life?
Role models are important because they act as life teachers. Let me explain. For academics, we have school teachers. For sports, we have coaches. For life in general, we have role models. They are the instructors of important life skills such as honesty and integrity.
Have you been a role model to anyone in the past?
Yes, I have been a role model to my younger brother. He is 7 years younger than me, so I've experienced many events which he comes across, and I try to teach him these lessons.
What responsibilities does a role model have?
The main responsibility a role model has, in my opinion, is to live in a positive way which reflects their beliefs. For example, a role model who teaches honesty and kindness must be honest and kind in their everyday life. It is not enough for a role model to say things, he must do them as well.
Can having role models be a bad thing? Why or why not?
That is a very interesting question. I may need a second. Well, I suppose having role models could be a bad thing if those role models did not live as they taught. Additionally, a person who taught bad attributes such as dishonesty, cheating, or lying would be a bad role model. Having a person like this in anyone's life would be terrible. Having bad role models would be worse than having no role model. However, having a good role model is the best case.
Okay, that is the end of part 3, and that is the end of the IELTS test. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Have a good day, Natasha.
You too.
Bye-bye. All right, now that you know some ways to buy some time, of course use some natural fillers like what I'm doing using that's another simple technique to buy time. Let's look at some other skills that are important for part 3. A very important step for part 3 is make sure to reflect the grammar. Usually the grammar of part 3 is a little bit more tricky than for part 1. You will often see sentences and questions that use present perfect, like for example, what have you done in the past to be a role model for other people? Or for example, conditionals. If you could be a role model, what would you do to make sure that you're helping all of those who look up to you? So pay attention to this more tricky grammar, conditionals, present perfect, past perfect, different kinds of opposites like which do you prefer and so on, and make sure that you give nice long full sentences which reflect the grammar that should be used in that situation. So try not to be too simple here. That will improve your marks. So pay attention to present perfect or perfect tenses. Pay attention to conditionals. And pay attention to compare and contrast questions. So again, when you have a compare and contrast question, make sure you use words like however, on the other hand, nevertheless, and so on. Often there will be questions in part 3 where the examiner will ask you, what is an advantage of being a role model? What can be a disadvantage of being a role model? For example, you would answer this, well, one advantage of being a role model is that many people will admire you and look up to you. However, a disadvantage can be that a role model often loses their privacy and feels a lot of pressure because they cannot make mistakes. So make sure you use nice long sentences and reflect the grammar. Again, number 2, be descriptive and try to include 1 or 2 examples to support your ideas or your answers. For example, one advantage of being a role model is that many people will like you. Famous singers such as Michael Jackson receive a lot of letters from their fans saying how they like them and how they love their music or love what they do. So include these specific examples in your answers to be visual and to help support what you're saying. So if you do all of these, then you will for sure get a much higher mark. Again, practicing this at home is very, very important. One really good advice I can give you is use your cell phone or use some other kind of voice recorder and try to record your speaking when you're practicing. So when you listen to the recording, you can hear your mistakes and you can hear how you're doing. Most cell phones these days have a voice recorder on them. So